rations, etc. 16 cases hams, 2 barrels flour, 22 barrels whiskey, 1 barrel sugar, 1 keg lemons, 2,000 cigars, 1 barrel pies, 1 ton of pemmican, 143 pair crutches, 2 barrels arnica, 1 bale of lint, 27 kegs paregoric. Apparatum: 25 spring mattresses, 2 hair ditto, bedding for same, 2 mosquito nets, 29 tents, scientific instruments, 97 ice axes, 5 cases dynamite, 7 cans nitroglycerin, 22 40-foot ladders, 2 miles of rope, 154 umbrellas. It was full 4 o'clock in the afternoon before my cavalcade was entirely ready. At that hour it began to move. In point of numbers and spectacular effect, it was the most imposing expedition that had ever marched from Zermatt. I commanded the chief guide to arrange the men and animals in single file, 12 feet apart, and lash them all together on a strong rope. He objected that the first 2 miles was a dead level, with plenty of room, and that the rope was never used except in very dangerous places. But I would not listen to that. My reading had taught me that many serious accidents had happened in the Alps simply from not having the people tied up soon enough. I was not going to add one to the list. The guide then obeyed my order. When the procession stood at ease, roped together and ready to move, I never saw a finer sight. It was 3,122 feet long, over half a mile. Every man but Harris and me was on foot, and had on his green veil and his blue goggles, and his white rag around his hat, and his coil of rope over one shoulder and under the other, and his ice axe in his belt, and carried his alpenstock in his left hand, his umbrella closed in his right, and his crutches slung at his back. The burdens of the pack mules and the horns of the cows were decked with the edelweiss and the alpine rose. I and my agent were the only persons mounted. We were in the post of danger in the extreme rear, and tied securely to 5 guides apiece. Our armor-bearers carried our ice axes, alpenstocks, and other implements for us. We were mounted upon very small donkeys as a measure of safety. In time of peril, we could straighten our legs and stand up and let the donkey walk from under. Still, I cannot recommend this sort of animal, at least for excursions of mere pleasure, because his ears interrupt the view. I and my agent possessed the regulation mountaineering costumes, but concluded to leave them behind, out of respect for the great numbers of tourists of both sexes who would be assembled in front of the hotels to see us pass, and also out of respect for the many tourists whom we expected to encounter on our expedition, we decided to make the ascent in evening dress. At 15 minutes past 4, I gave the command to move, and my subordinates passed it along the line. The great crowd in front of the Monte Rosa Hotel parted in twain with a cheer as the procession approached, and as the head of it was filing by, I gave the order, "Unlimber, make ready, hoist!" And with one impulse, up went my half-mile of umbrellas. It was a beautiful sight, and a total surprise to the spectators. Nothing like that had ever been seen in the Alps before. The applause it brought forth was deeply gratifying to me, and I rode by with my plug hat in my hand to testify my appreciation of it. It was the only testimony I could offer, for I was too full to speak. We watered the caravan at the cold stream, which rushes down a trough near the end of the village, and soon afterward left the haunts of civilization behind us. About 5:30 o'clock we arrived at a bridge which spans the Visp, and after throwing over a detachment to see if it was safe, the caravan crossed without accident. The way now led, by a gentle ascent, carpeted with fresh green grass, to the church of Winkelmatten. Without stopping to examine this edifice, I executed a flank movement to the right, and crossed the bridge over the Findelenbach after first testing its strength. Here I deployed to the right again, and presently entered an inviting stretch of meadowland, which was unoccupied save by a couple of deserted huts toward its furthest extremity. These meadows offered an excellent camping place. We pitched our tents, supped, established a proper guard, recorded the events of the day, and then went to bed. We rose at 2 in the morning and dressed by candlelight. It was a dismal and chilly business. A few stars were shining, but the general heavens were overcast, and the great shaft of the Matterhorn was draped in a sable pall of clouds. The chief guide advised a delay. He said he feared it was going to rain. We waited until 9 o'clock and then got away in tolerably clear weather. Our course led up some terrific steeps, densely wooded with larches and cedars, and traversed by paths which the rains had guttered and which were obstructed by loose stones. To add to the danger and inconvenience, we were constantly meeting returning tourists on foot or horseback, and as constantly being crowded and battered by ascending tourists who were in a hurry and wanted to get by. Our troubles thickened. About the middle of the afternoon, the 17 guides called a halt and held a consultation. After consulting an hour, they said their first suspicion remained intact. That is to say, they believed they were lost. I asked if they did not know it. No, they said they couldn't absolutely know whether they were lost or not, because none of them had ever been in that part of the country before. They had a strong instinct that they were lost, but they had no proofs, except that they did not know where they were. They had met no tourists for some time, and they considered that a suspicious sign. Plainly, we were in an ugly fix. The guides were naturally unwilling to go alone and seek a way out of the difficulty, so we all went together. For better security, we moved slowly and cautiously, for the forest was very dense. We did not move up the mountain, but around it, hoping to strike across the old trail. Toward nightfall, when we were about tired out, we came up against a rock as big as a cottage. This barrier took all the remaining spirit out of the men, and a panic of fear and despair ensued. They moaned and wept and said they should never see their homes and their dear ones again. Then they began to upbraid me for bringing them upon this fatal expedition. Some even muttered threats against me. Clearly, it was no time to show weakness. So I made a speech in which I said that other Alp climbers had been in as perilous a position as this, and yet by courage and perseverance had escaped. I promised to stand by them. I promised to rescue them. I closed by saying we had plenty of provisions to maintain us for quite a siege, and did they suppose Zermatt would allow 1/2 mile of men and mules to mysteriously disappear during any considerable time, right above their noses, and make no inquiries? No, Zermatt would send out searching expeditions, and we should be saved. This speech had a great effect. The men pitched the tents with some little show of cheerfulness, and we were snugly under cover when the night shut down. I now reaped the reward of my wisdom in providing one article which is not mentioned in any book of Alpine adventure but this. I refer to the paregoric. But for that beneficent drug, not one of those men would have slept a moment during that fearful night. But for the gentle persuader, they must have tossed, unsoothed, the night through, for the whiskey was for me. Yes, they would have risen in the morning unfitted for their heavy task. As it was, everybody slept but my agent and me, only we two and the barkeepers. I would not permit myself to sleep at such a time. I considered myself responsible for all those lives. I meant to be on hand and ready in case of avalanches. I am aware now that there were no avalanches up there, but I did not know it then. We watched the weather all through that awful night and kept an eye on the barometer to be prepared for the least change. There was not the slightest change recorded by the instrument during the whole time. Words cannot describe the comfort that friendly, hopeful, steadfast thing was to me in that season of trouble. It was a defective barometer and had no hand but the stationary brass pointer, but I did not know that until afterwards. If I should be in such a situation again, I should not wish for any barometer but that one. All hands rose at 2 in the morning and took breakfast, and as soon as it was light we roped ourselves together and went at that rock. For some time we tried the hook rope and other means of scaling it, but without success, that is, without perfect success. The hook caught once, and Harris started up it, hand over hand, but the hold broke, and if there had not happened to be a chaplain sitting underneath at the time, Harris would certainly have been crippled. As it was the chaplain. He took to his crutches, and I ordered the hook rope to be laid aside. It was too dangerous an implement where so many were standing around. We were puzzled for a while. Then somebody thought of the ladders. One of these was leaned against the rock, and the men went up it tied together in couples. Another ladder was sent up for use in descending. At the end of half an hour everybody was over, and that rock was conquered. We gave our first grand shout of triumph, but the joy was short-lived, for somebody asked how we were going to get the animals over. This was a serious difficulty. In fact, it was an impossibility. The courage of the men began to waver immediately. Once more we were threatened with a panic. But when the danger was most imminent, we were saved in a mysterious way. A mule, which had attracted attention from the beginning by its disposition to experiment, tried to eat a 5-pound can of nitroglycerin. This happened right alongside the rock. The explosion threw us all to the ground and covered us with dirt and debris. It frightened us extremely, too, for the crash it made was deafening, and the violence of the shock made the ground tremble. However, we were grateful, for the rock was gone. Its place was occupied by a new cellar, about 30 feet across by 15 feet deep. The explosion was heard as far as Zermatt, and an hour and a half afterwards many citizens of that town were knocked down and quite seriously injured by descending portions of mule meat, frozen solid. This shows, better than any estimate in figures, how high the experimenter went. We had nothing to do now but bridge the cellar and proceed on our way. With a cheer, the men went at their work. I attended to the engineering myself. I appointed a strong detail to cut down trees with ice axes and trim them for piers to support the bridge. This was a slow business, for ice axes are not good to cut wood with. I caused my piers to be firmly set up in ranks in the cellar, and upon them I laid 6 of my 40-foot ladders, side by side, and laid 6 more on top of them. Upon this bridge I caused a bed of boughs to be spread, and on top of the boughs a bed of earth 6 inches deep. I stretched ropes upon either side to serve as railings, and then my bridge was complete. A train of elephants could have crossed it in safety and comfort. By nightfall the caravan was on the other side, and the ladders taken up. Next morning we went on in good spirits for a while, though our way was slow and difficult by reason of the steep and rocky nature of the ground and the thickness of the forest. But at last a dull despondency crept into the men's faces, and it was apparent that not only they, but even the guides, were now convinced that we were lost. The fact that we still met no tourists was a circumstance that was but too significant. Another thing seemed to suggest that we were not only lost, but very badly lost, for there must surely be searching parties on the road before this time, yet we had seen no sign of them. Demoralization was spreading. Something must be done, and done quickly, too. Fortunately, I am not unfertile in expedients, I contrived one now which commended itself to all, for it promised well. I took 3/4 of a mile of rope, and fastened one end of it around the waist of a guide, and told him to go and find the road, whilst the caravan waited. I instructed him to guide himself back by the rope in case of failure. In case of success, he was to give the rope a series of violent jerks, whereupon the expedition would go to him at once. He departed, and in 2 minutes had disappeared among the trees. I paid out the rope myself, while everybody watched the crawling thing with eager eyes. The rope crept away quite slowly at times, at other times with some briskness. Twice or thrice we seemed to get the signal, and a shout was just ready to break from the men's lips when they perceived it was a false alarm. But at last, when over half a mile of rope had slidden away, it stopped gliding and stood absolutely still 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3, while we held our breath and watched. Was the guide resting? Was he scanning the country from some high point? Was he inquiring of a chance mountaineer? Stop! Had he failed from excess of fatigue and anxiety? This thought gave us a shock. I was in the very act of detailing an expedition to succor him, when the cord was assailed with a series of such frantic jerks that I could hardly keep hold of it. The huzzah that went up then was good to hear. "Saved! Saved!" was the word that rang out all down the long rank of the caravan. We rose up and started at once. We found the route to be good enough for a while, but it began to grow difficult by and by, and this feature steadily increased. When we judged we had gone half a mile, we momently expected to see the guide, but no, he was not visible anywhere. Neither was he waiting, for the rope was still moving. Consequently, he was doing the same. This argued that he had not found the road yet, but was marching to it with some peasant. There was nothing for us to do but plod along, and this we did. At the end of 3 hours we were still plodding. This was not only mysterious, but exasperating, and very fatiguing, too, for we had tried hard, along at first, to catch up with the guide, but had only fagged ourselves in vain, for although he was traveling slowly, he was yet able to go faster than the hampered caravan over such ground. At 3 in the afternoon we were nearly dead with exhaustion, and still the rope was slowly gliding out. The murmurs against the guide had been growing steadily, and at last they were become loud and savage. A mutiny ensued. The men refused to proceed. They declared that we had been traveling over and over the same ground all day in a kind of circle. They demanded that our end of the rope be made fast to a tree, so as to halt the guide until we could overtake him and kill him. This was not an unreasonable requirement, so I gave the order. As soon as the rope was tied, the expedition moved forward with that alacrity which the thirst for vengeance usually inspires. But after a tiresome march of almost half a mile, we came to a hill covered thick with a crumbly rubbish of stones, and so steep that no man of us all was now in a condition to climb it. Every attempt failed, and ended in crippling somebody. Within 20 minutes I had 5 men on crutches. Whenever a climber tried to assist himself by the rope, it yielded and let him tumble backwards. The frequency of this result suggested an idea to me. I ordered the caravan to bout face and form in marching order. I then made the tow rope fast to the rear mule and gave the command, "Mark time, by the right flank, forward, march!" The procession began to move to the impressive strains of a battle chant, and I said to myself, "Now, if the rope don't break, I judge this will fetch that guide into the camp." I watched the rope gliding down the hill, and presently, when I was all fixed for triumph, I was confronted by a disappointment. There was no guide tied to the rope. It was only a very indignant old black ram. The fury of the baffled expedition exceeded all bounds. They even wanted to wreak their unreasoning vengeance on this innocent, dumb brute, but I stood between them and their prey, menaced by a bristling wall of ice-axes and alpenstocks, and proclaimed that there was but one road to this murder, and it was directly over my course. Even as I spoke, I saw that my doom was sealed, except a miracle supervened to divert these madmen from their fell purpose. I see that sickening wall of weapons now. I see that advancing host as I saw it then. I see the hate in those cruel eyes. I remember how I dropped my head upon my breast. I feel again the sudden earthquake shock in my rear, administered by the very ram I was sacrificing myself to save. I hear once more the typhoon of laughter that burst from the assaulting column as I clove it from van to rear, like a sepoy shot from a Rodman gun. I was saved. Yes, I was saved, and by the merciful instinct of ingratitude which nature had planted in the breast of that treacherous beast. The grace which eloquence had failed to work in those men's hearts had been wrought by a laugh. The ram was set free, and my life was spared. We lived to find out that that guide had deserted us as soon as he had placed a half-mile between himself and us. To avert suspicion, he had judged it best that the line should continue to move, so he caught that ram, and at the time that he was sitting on it, making the rope fast to it, we were imagining he was lying in a swoon, overcome by fatigue and distress. When he allowed the ram to get up, it fell to plunging around, trying to rid itself of the rope, and this was the signal which we had risen up with glad shouts to obey. We had followed this ram round and round in a circle all day, a thing which was proved by the discovery that we had watered the expedition 7 times at one and the same spring in 7 hours. As expert a woodman as I am, I had somehow failed to notice this until my attention was called to it by a hog. This hog was always wallowing there, and as he was the only hog we saw, his frequent repetition, together with the unvarying similarity to himself, finally caused me to reflect that he must be the same hog, and this led me to the deduction that this must be the same spring also, which indeed it was. I made a note of this curious thing as showing in a striking manner the relative difference between glacial action and the action of the hog. It is now a well-established fact that glaciers move. I consider that my observations go to show, with equal conclusiveness, that a hog in a spring does not move. I shall be glad to receive the opinions of other observers upon this point. To return for an explanatory moment to that guide, and then I shall be done with him. After leaving the ram tied to the rope, he had wandered at large a while, and then happened to run across a cow. Judging that a cow would naturally know more than a guide, he took her by the tail, and the result justified his judgment. She nibbled her leisurely way downhill till it was near milking time. Then she struck for home, and towed him into Zermatt. Chapter 38. We went into camp on that wild spot to which that ram had brought us. The men were greatly fatigued. Their conviction that we were lost was forgotten in the cheer of a good supper, and before the reaction had a chance to set in, I loaded them up with paregoric and put them to bed. Next morning I was considering in my mind our desperate situation and trying to think of a remedy, when Harris came to me with a Baedeker map, which showed conclusively that the mountain we were on was still in Switzerland. Yes, every part of it was in Switzerland, so we were not lost after all. This was an immense relief. It lifted the weight of 2 such mountains from my breast. I immediately had the news disseminated and the map exhibited. The effect was wonderful. As soon as the men saw with their own eyes that they knew where they were, and that it was only the summit that was lost and not themselves, they cheered up instantly and said with one accord, "Let the summit take care of itself. They were not interested in its troubles." Our distresses being at an end, I now determined to rest the men in camp and give the scientific department of the expedition a chance. First, I made a barometric observation to get our altitude, but I could not perceive that there was any result. I knew by my scientific reading that either thermometers or barometers ought to be boiled to make them accurate. I did not know which it was, so I boiled both. There was still no result, so I examined these instruments and discovered that they possessed radical blemishes. The barometer had no hand but the brass pointer, and the ball of the thermometer was stuffed with tinfoil. I might have boiled those things to rags and never found out anything. I might have boiled those things to rags and never found out anything. I hunted up another barometer. It was new and perfect. I boiled it half an hour in a pot of bean soup which the cooks were making. The result was unexpected. The instrument was not affected at all, but there was such a strong barometer taste to the soup that the head cook, who was a most conscientious person, changed its name in the bill of fare. The dish was so greatly liked by all that I ordered the cook to have barometer soup every day. It was believed that the barometer might eventually be injured, but I did not care for that. I had demonstrated to my satisfaction that it could not tell how high a mountain was. Therefore I had no real use for it. Changes of the weather I could take care of without it. I did not wish to know when the weather was going to be good. What I wanted to know was when it was going to be bad, and this I could find out from Harris's corns. Harris had had his corns tested and regulated at the government observatory in Heidelberg, and one could depend upon them with confidence. So I transferred the new barometer to the cooking department to be used for the official mess. It was found that even a pretty fair article of soup could be made with the defective barometer, so I allowed that one to be transferred to the subordinate messes. I next boiled the thermometer and got a most excellent result. The mercury went up to about 200 degrees Fahrenheit. In the opinion of the other scientists of the expedition, this seemed to indicate that we had attained the extraordinary altitude of 200,000 feet above sea level. Science places the line of eternal snow at about 10,000 feet above sea level. There was no snow where we were. Consequently, it was proven that the eternal snow line ceases anywhere above the 10,000-foot level and does not begin any more. This was an interesting fact, and one which had not been observed by any observer before. It was as valuable as interesting, too, since it would open up the deserted summits of the highest Alps to population and agriculture. It was a proud thing to be where we were, yet it caused us a pang to reflect that but for that ram, we might just as well have been 200,000 feet higher. The success of my last experiment induced me to try an experiment with my photographic apparatus. I got it out and boiled one of my cameras, but the thing was a failure. It made the wood swell up and burst, and I could not see that the lenses were any better than they were before. I now concluded to boil a guide. It might improve him, it could not impair his usefulness. But I was not allowed to proceed. Guides have no feeling for science, and this one would not consent to be made uncomfortable in its interest. In the midst of my scientific work, one of those needless accidents happened which are always occurring among the ignorant and thoughtless. A porter shot at a chamois and missed it and crippled the Latinist. This was not a serious matter to me, for a Latinist's duties are as well performed on crutches as otherwise. But the fact remained that if the Latinist had not happened to be in the way, a mule would have got that load. That would have been quite another matter, For when it comes down to a question of value, there is a palpable difference between a Latinist and a mule. I could not depend on having a Latinist in the right place every time, so to make things safe, I ordered that in future the chamois must not be hunted within the limits of the camp with any other weapon than the forefinger. My nerves had hardly grown quiet after this affair when they got another shake-up, one which utterly unmanned me for a moment. A rumor swept suddenly through the camp that one of the barkeepers had fallen over a precipice. However, it turned out that it was only a chaplain. I had laid in an extra force of chaplains, purposely to be prepared for emergencies like this, but by some unaccountable oversight had come away rather short-handed in the matter of barkeepers. On the following morning we moved on, well refreshed and in good spirits. I remember this day with peculiar pleasure because it saw our road restored to us. Yes, we found our road again, and in quite an extraordinary way. We had plodded along some 2 hours and a half when we came up against a solid mass of rock about 20 feet high. I did not need to be instructed by a mule this time. I was already beginning to know more than any mule in the expedition. I at once put in a blast of dynamite and lifted that rock out of the way. But to my surprise and mortification, I found that there had been a chalet on top of it. I picked up such members of the family as fell in my vicinity, and subordinates of my corps collected the rest. None of these poor people were injured, happily, but they were much annoyed. I explained to the head chaleteer just how the thing happened, and that I was only searching for the road, and would certainly have given him timely notice if I had known he was up there. I said I had meant no harm, and hoped I had not lowered myself in his estimation by raising him a few rods in the air. I said many other judicious things, and finally, when I offered to rebuild his chalet and pay for breakages and throw in the cellar, he was mollified and satisfied. He hadn't any cellar at all before. He would not have as good a view now as formerly, but what he had lost in view, he had gained in cellar, by exact measurement. He said there wasn't another hole like that in the mountains, and he would have been right if the late mule had not tried to eat up the nitroglycerin. I put 116 men at work, and they rebuilt the chalet from its own debris in 15 minutes. It was a good deal more picturesque than it was before, too. The man said we were now on the Feli Stutz above the Schwegmatt, information which I was glad to get, since it gave us our position to a degree of peculiarity which we had not been accustomed to for a day or so. We also learned that we were standing at the foot of the Riffelberg proper, and that the initial chapter of our work was completed. We had a fine view from here of the energetic Visp as it makes its first plunge into the world from under a huge arch of solid ice, worn through the footwall of the great Gorner Glacier, and we could also see the Furgenbach, which is the outlet of the Furgen Glacier. The mule road to the summit of the Riffelberg passed right in front of the chalet, a circumstance which we almost immediately noticed because a procession of tourists was filing along it pretty much all the time. Pretty much may not be elegant English, but it is high time it was. There is no elegant word or phrase which means just what it means, MT. The chaletier's business consisted in furnishing refreshments to tourists. My blast had interrupted this trade for a few minutes by breaking all the bottles on the place, but I gave the man a lot of whiskey to sell for Alpine champagne, and a lot of vinegar, which would answer for Rhine wine. Consequently, trade was soon as brisk as ever. Leaving the expedition outside to rest, I quartered myself in the chalet with Harris, purposing to correct my journals and scientific observations before continuing the ascent. I had hardly begun my work when a tall, slender, vigorous American youth of about 23, who was on his way down the mountain, entered and came toward me with that breezy self-complacency which is the adolescent's idea of the well-bred ease of the man of the world. His hair was short and parted accurately in the middle, and he had all the look of an American person who would be likely to begin his signature with an initial and spell his middle name out. He introduced himself, smiling a smirky smile borrowed from the courtiers of the stage, extended a fair-skinned talon, and whilst he gripped my hand in it, he bent his body forward 3 times at the hips, as the stage courtier does, and said in the airiest and most condescending and patronizing way, I quote his exact language, "Very glad to make your acquaintance, I'm sure. Very glad indeed, assure you. I've read all your little efforts and greatly admired them, and when I heard you were here, I indicated a chair, and he sat down. This grandee was the grandson of an American of considerable note in his day, and not wholly forgotten yet. A man who came so near being a great man that he was quite generally accounted one while he lived. I slowly paced the floor, pondering scientific problems, and heard this conversation. Grandson. First visit to Europe? Harris. Mine, yes. G.S., with a soft reminiscent sigh suggestive of bygone joys that may be tasted in their freshness but once. Ah, I know what it is to you. A first visit. Ah, the romance of it. I wish I could feel it again. H. Yes, I find it exceeds all my dreams. It is enchantment. I go... G.S., with a dainty gesture of the hand signifying, "Spare me your callow enthusiasms, good friend." Yes, I know. You go to cathedrals and exclaim, and you drag through league-long picture galleries and exclaim, and you stand here and there and yonder upon historic ground and continue to exclaim, and you are permeated with your first crude conceptions of art, and are proud and happy. Ah, yes, proud and happy, that expresses it. Yes, enjoy it. It is right. It is an innocent revel. H. And you, don't you do these things now? G.S. Aye. Oh, that is very good. My dear sir, when you are as old a traveler as I am, you will not ask such a question as that. I visit the regulation cathedral, do the worn round of the regulation sites, yet, excuse me. H. Well, what do you do, then? G.S. Do? I flit, and flit, for I am ever on the wing, but I avoid the herd. Today I am in Paris, tomorrow in Berlin, anon in Rome, but you would look for me in vain in the galleries of the Louvre, or the common resorts of the gazers in those other capitals. If you would find me, you must look in the unvisited nooks and corners where others never think of going. One day you will find me making myself at home in some obscure peasant's cabin. Another day you will find me in some forgotten castle, worshipping some little gem of art which the careless eye has overlooked, and which the inexperienced would despise. Again, you will find me a guest in the inner sanctuaries of palaces, while the herd is content to get a hurried glimpse of the unused chambers by feeing a servant. H. You are a guest in such places? G.S. And a welcome one. H. It is surprising. How does it come? G.S. My grandfather's name is a passport to all the courts in Europe. I have only to utter that name, and every door is open to me. I flit from court to court at my own free will and pleasure, and am always welcome. I am as much at home in the palaces of Europe as you are among your relatives. I know every titled person in Europe, I think. I have my pockets full of invitations all the time. I am under promise now to go to Italy, where I am to be the guest of a succession of the noblest houses in the land. In Berlin, my life is a continued round of gaiety in the Imperial Palace. It is the same wherever I go. H. It must be very pleasant, but it must make Boston seem a little slow when you are at home. G.S. Yes, of course it does, but I don't go home much. There's no life there, little to feed a man's higher nature. Boston's very narrow, you know. She doesn't know it, and you couldn't convince her of it, so I say nothing when I'm there. What's the use? Yes, Boston is very narrow, but she has such a good opinion of herself that she can't see it. A man who has traveled as much as I have and seen as much of the world sees it plain enough, but he can't cure it, you know. So the best way is to leave it and seek a sphere which is more in harmony with his tastes and culture. I run across there once a year, perhaps, when I have nothing important on hand, but I'm very soon back again. I spend my time in Europe. H. I see. You map out your plans and... G.S. No, excuse me, I don't map out any plans. I simply follow the inclination of the day. I am limited by no ties, no requirements. I am not bound in any way. I am too old a traveler to hamper myself with deliberate purposes. I am simply a traveler, an inveterate traveler, a man of the world, in a word. I can call myself by no other name. I do not say I am going here or I am going there. I say nothing at all. I only act. For instance, next week you may find me the guest of a grandee of Spain, or you may find me off for Venice or flitting toward Dresden. I shall probably go to Egypt presently. Friends will say to friends, he is at the Nile cataracts. And at that very moment they will be surprised to learn that I'm away off yonder to India somewhere. I am a constant surprise to people. They are always saying, yes, he was in Jerusalem when we heard of him last, but goodness knows where he is now. Presently the grandson rose to leave, discovered he had an appointment with some emperor, perhaps. He did his graces over again, gripped me with one talon at arm's length, pressed his hat against his stomach with the other, bent his body in the middle 3 times, murmuring, "Please, monsieur, great pleasure, monsieur. Wish you much success." Then he removed his gracious presence. It is a great and solemn thing to have a grandfather. I have not purposed to misrepresent this boy in any way, for what little indignation he excited in me soon passed, and left nothing behind it but compassion. One cannot keep up a grudge against a vacuum. I have tried to repeat the lad's very words. If I have failed anywhere, I have at least not failed to reproduce the marrow and meaning of what he said. He and the innocent chatterbox whom I met on the Swiss lake are the most unique and interesting specimens of young America I came across during my foreign tramping. I have made honest portraits of them, not caricatures. The grandson of 23 referred to himself 5 or 6 times as an old traveler, and as many as 3 times, with a serene complacency which was maddening, as a man of the world. There was something very delicious about his leaving Boston to her narrowness, unreproved and uninstructed. I formed the caravan in marching order presently, and after riding down the line to see that it was properly roped together, gave the command to proceed. In a little while the road carried us to open, grassy land. We were above the troublesome forest now, and had an uninterrupted view straight before us of our summit, the summit of the Riffelberg. We followed the mule road, a zigzag course, now to the right, now to the left, but always up, and always crowded and incommoded by going and coming files of reckless tourists who were never, in a single instance, tied together. I was obliged to exert the utmost care and caution, for in many places the road was not 2 yards wide, and often the lower side of it sloped away in slanting precipices 8 and even 9 feet deep. I had to encourage the men constantly to keep them from giving way to their unmanly fears. We might have made the summit before night, but for a delay caused by the loss of an umbrella. I was for allowing the umbrella to remain lost, but the men murmured, and with reason, for in this exposed region we stood in peculiar need of protection against avalanches. So I went into camp and detached a strong party to go after the missing article. The difficulties of the next morning were severe, but our courage was high, for our goal was near. At noon we conquered the last impediment. We stood at last upon the summit, and without the loss of a single man, except the mule that ate the glycerin. Our great achievement was achieved. The possibility of the impossible was demonstrated, and Harris and I walked proudly into the great dining room of the Riffelberg Hotel and stood our alpenstocks up in the corner. Yes, I had made the grand ascent, but it was a mistake to do it in evening dress. The plug hats were battered, the swallowtails were fluttering rags, mud added no grace. The general effect was unpleasant and even disreputable. There are about 75 tourists at the hotel, mainly ladies and little children, and they gave us an admiring welcome which paid us for all our privations and sufferings. The ascent had been made, and the names and dates now stand recorded on a stone monument there to prove it to all future tourists. I boiled a thermometer and took an altitude with a most curious result. The summit was not as high as the point on the mountainside where I had taken the first altitude. Suspecting that I had made an important discovery, I prepared to verify it. There happened to be a still higher summit called the Gorner Grat above the hotel, and notwithstanding the fact that it overlooks a glacier from a dizzy height, and that the ascent is difficult and dangerous, I resolved to venture up there and boil a thermometer. So I sent a strong party with some borrowed hose, in charge of 2 chiefs of service, to dig a stairway in the soil all the way, and this I ascended, roped to the guides. This breezy height was the summit proper, so I accomplished even more than I had originally purposed to do. This foolhardy exploit is recorded on another stone monument. I boiled my thermometer, and sure enough this spot, which purported to be 2,000 feet higher than the locality of the hotel, turned out to be 9,000 feet lower. Thus the fact was clearly demonstrated that above a certain point, the higher a point seems to be, the lower it actually is. Our ascent itself was a great achievement, but this contribution to science was an inconceivably greater matter. Cavillers object that water boils at a lower and lower temperature the higher and higher you go, and hence the apparent anomaly. I answer that I do not base my theory upon what the boiling water does, but upon what a boiled thermometer says. You can't go behind the thermometer. I had a magnificent view of Monte Rosa, and apparently all the rest of the Alpine world from that high place. All the circling horizon was piled high with a mighty tumult of snowy crests. One might have imagined he saw before him the tented camps of a beleaguering host of Brobdingnagians. But lonely, conspicuous, and superb rose that wonderful upright wedge, the Matterhorn. Its precipitous sides were powdered over with snow, and the upper half hidden in thick clouds which now and then dissolved to cobweb films, and gave brief glimpses of the imposing tower as through a veil. A little later, the Matterhorn took to himself the semblance of a volcano. He was stripped naked to his apex. Around this circled vast wreaths of white cloud, which strung slowly out and streamed away slantwise toward the sun, a 20-mile stretch of rolling and tumbling vapor, and looking just as if it were pouring out of a crater. Note: I had the very unusual luck to catch one little momentary glimpse of the Matterhorn wholly unencumbered by clouds. I leveled my photographic apparatus at it without the loss of an instant, and should have got an elegant picture if my donkey had not interfered. It was my purpose to draw this photograph all by myself for my book, but I was obliged to put the mountain part of it into the hands of the professional artist because I found I could not do landscape well. Later again, one of the mountain's sides was clean and clear, and another side densely clothed from base to summit in thick smoke-like cloud which feathered off and blew around the shaft's sharp edge like the smoke around the corners of a burning building. The Matterhorn is always experimenting, and always gets up fine effects, too. In the sunset, when all the lower world is palled in gloom, it points toward heaven out of the pervading blackness like a finger of fire. In the sunrise, well, they say it is very fine in the sunrise. Authorities agree that there is no such tremendous layout of snowy alpine magnitude, grandeur, and sublimity to be seen from any other accessible point as the tourist may see from the summit of the Riffelberg. Therefore let the tourist rope himself up and go there, for I have shown that with nerve, caution, and judgment, the thing can be done. I wish to add one remark here, in parentheses, so to speak, suggested by the word snowy, which I have just used. We have all seen hills and mountains and levels with snow on them, and so we think we know all the aspects and effects produced by snow, but indeed we do not, until we have seen the Alps. Possibly mass and distance add something, at any rate something is added. Among other noticeable things, there is a dazzling, intense whiteness about the distant alpine snow when the sun is on it, which one recognizes as peculiar and not familiar to the eye. The snow which one is accustomed to has a tint to it. Painters usually give it a bluish cast, but there is no perceptible tint to the distant alpine snow when it is trying to look its whitest. As to the unimaginable splendor of it when the sun is blazing down on it, well, it simply is unimaginable. Chapter 39. A guidebook is a queer thing. The reader has just seen what a man who undertakes the great ascent from Zermatt to the Riffelberg Hotel must experience. Yet Baedeker makes these strange statements concerning this matter. 1. Distance, 3 hours. 2. The road cannot be mistaken. 3. Guide unnecessary. 4. Distance from Riffelberg Hotel to the Gorner Grat, 1 hour and a half. 5. Ascent simple and easy. Guide unnecessary. 6. Elevation of Riffelberg Hotel above sea level, 5,315 feet. 7. Elevation of the Gorner Grat above sea level, 10,289 feet. I have pretty effectually throttled these errors by sending him the following demonstrated facts. 1. Distance from Zermatt to Riffelberg Hotel, 7 days. 2. The road can be mistaken. If I am the first that did it, I want the credit of it, too. 3. Guides are necessary, for none but a native can read those fingerboards. 4. The estimate of the elevation of the several localities above sea level is perfectly correct for Baedeker. He only misses it about 180 or 90,000 feet. I found my arnica invaluable. My men were suffering excruciatingly from the friction of sitting down so much. During 2 or 3 days, not one of them was able to do more than lie down or walk about. Yet so effective was the arnica that on the 4th all were able to sit up. I consider that more than to anything else I owe the success of our great undertaking to arnica and paregoric. My men being restored to health and strength, my main perplexity now was how to get them down the mountain again. I was not willing to expose the brave fellows to the perils, fatigues, and hardships of that fearful route again, if it could be helped. First I thought of balloons, but of course I had to give that idea up, for balloons were not procurable. I thought of several other expedients, but upon consideration discarded them for cause. But at last I hit it. I was aware that the movement of glaciers is an established fact, for I had read it in Baedeker. So I resolved to take passage for Zermatt on the Great Gorner Glacier. Very good. The next thing was how to get down to the glacier comfortably, for the mule road to it was long and winding and wearisome. I set my mind at work and soon thought out a plan. One looks straight down upon the vast frozen river called the Gorner Glacier from the Gorner Grat, a sheer precipice 1,200 feet high. We had 154 umbrellas, and what is an umbrella but a parachute? I mentioned this noble idea to Harris with enthusiasm, and was about to order the expedition to form on the Gorner Grat with their umbrellas, and prepare for flight by platoons, each platoon in command of a guide, when Harris stopped me and urged me not to be too hasty. He asked me if this method of descending the Alps had ever been tried before. I said no, I had not heard of an instance. Then in his opinion it was a matter of considerable gravity. In his opinion it would not be well to send the whole command over the cliff at once. A better way would be to send down a single individual first and see how he fared. I saw the wisdom of this idea instantly. I said as much, and thanked my agent cordially, and told him to take his umbrella and try the thing right away, and wave his hat when he got down if he struck in a soft place, and then I would ship the rest right along. Harris was greatly touched with this mark of confidence, and said so in a voice that had a perceptible tremble in it. But at the same time he said he did not feel himself worthy of so conspicuous a favor, that it might cause jealousy in the command, for there were plenty who would not hesitate to say he had used underhand means to get the appointment, whereas his conscience would bear him witness that he had not sought it at all, not even in his secret heart desired it. I said these words did him extreme credit, but that he must not throw away the imperishable distinction of being the first man to descend an Alp per parachute, simply to save the feelings of some envious underlings. No, I said he must accept the appointment. It was no longer an invitation, it was a command. He thanked me with effusion, and said that putting the thing in this form removed every objection. He retired, and soon returned with his umbrella, his eyes flaming with gratitude, and his cheeks pallid with joy. Just then the head guide passed along. Harris's expression changed to one of infinite tenderness, and he said, "That man did me a cruel injury 4 days ago, and I said in my heart he should live to perceive and confess that the only noble revenge a man can take upon his enemy is to return good for evil. I resign in his favor. Appoint him." I threw my arms around the generous fellow and said, "Harris, you are the noblest soul that lives. You shall not regret this sublime act. Neither shall the world fail to know of it. You shall have opportunities far transcending this one, too, if I live. Remember that." I called the head guide to me and appointed him on the spot, but the thing aroused no enthusiasm in him. He did not take to the idea at all. He said, "Tie myself to an umbrella and jump over the Gorner Grat, "Excuse me, there are a great many pleasanter roads to the devil than that." Upon a discussion of the subject with him, it appeared that he considered the project distinctly and decidedly dangerous. I was not convinced, yet I was not willing to try the experiment in any risky way, that is, in a way that might cripple the strength and efficiency of the expedition. I was about at my wits' end when it occurred to me to try it on the Latinist. He was called in, but he declined on the plea of inexperience, diffidence in public, lack of curiosity, and I don't know what all. Another man declined on account of a cold in the head, thought he ought to avoid exposure. Another could not jump well, never could jump well, did not believe he could jump so far without long and patient practice. Another was afraid it was going to rain, and his umbrella had a hole in it. Everybody had an excuse. The result was what the reader has by this time guessed. The most magnificent idea that was ever conceived had to be abandoned from sheer lack of a person with enterprise enough to carry it out. Yes, I actually had to give that thing up, whilst doubtless I should live to see somebody use it and take all the credit from me. Well, I had to go overland. There was no other way. I marched the expedition down the steep and tedious mule path, and took up as good a position as I could upon the middle of the glacier, because Baedeker said the middle part travels the fastest. As a measure of economy, however, I put some of the heavier baggage on the shoreward parts to go as slow freight. I waited and waited, but the glacier did not move. Night was coming on. The darkness began to gather. Still, we did not budge. It occurred to me that there might be a timetable in Baedeker. It would be well to find out the hours of starting. I called for the book. It could not be found. Bradshaw would certainly contain a timetable, but no Bradshaw could be found. Very well, I must make the best of the situation. So I pitched the tents, picketed the animals, milked the cows, had supper, paregoricked the men, established the watch, and went to bed, with orders to call me as soon as we came in sight of Zermatt. I awoke about 10:30 next morning and looked around. We hadn't budged a peg. At first I could not understand it. Then it occurred to me that the old thing must be aground. So I cut down some trees and rigged a spar on the starboard and another on the port side, and fooled away upwards of 3 hours trying to spar her off. But it was no use. She was 1/2 mile wide and 15 or 20 miles long, and there was no telling just whereabouts she was aground. The men began to show uneasiness too, and presently they came flying to me with ashy faces, saying she had sprung a leak. Nothing but my cool behavior at this critical time saved us from another panic. I ordered them to show me the place. They led me to a spot where a huge boulder lay in a deep pool of clear and brilliant water. It did look like a pretty bad leak, but I kept that to myself. I made a pump and set the men to work to pump out the glacier. We made a success of it. I perceived then that it was not a leak at all. This boulder had descended from a precipice and stopped on the ice in the middle of the glacier, and the sun had warmed it up every day, and consequently it had melted its way deeper and deeper into the ice, until at last it reposed, as we had found it, in a deep pool of the clearest and coldest water. Presently Baedeker was found again, and I hunted eagerly for the timetable. There was none. The book simply said the glacier was moving all the time. This was satisfactory, so I shut up the book and chose a good position to view the scenery as we passed along. I stood there some time enjoying the trip, but at last it occurred to me that we did not seem to be gaining any on the scenery. I said to myself, This confounded old thing's aground again, sure, and opened Baedeker to see if I could run across any remedy for these annoying interruptions. I soon found a sentence which threw a dazzling light upon the matter. It said, "The Gorner Glacier travels at an average rate of a little less than an inch a day." I have seldom felt so outraged. I have seldom had my confidence so wantonly betrayed. I made a small calculation. 1 inch a day, say 30 feet a year, estimated distance to Zermatt, 3 1/18 miles, time required to go by glacier, a little over 500 years. I said to myself, I can walk it quicker, and before I will patronize such a fraud as this, I will do it. When I revealed to Harris the fact that the passenger part of this glacier, the central part, the lightning express part, so to speak, was not due in Zermatt till the summer of 2378, and that the baggage coming along the slow edge would not arrive until some generations later, he burst out with, "That is European management all over. An inch a day. Think of that. 500 years to go a trifle over 3 miles. But I am not a bit surprised. It's a Catholic glacier. You can tell by the look of it. And the management." I said no, I believed nothing but the extreme end of it was in a Catholic canton. "Well, then it's a government glacier," said Harris. "It's all the same. Over here the government runs everything, so everything's slow. Slow and ill-managed. But with us everything's done by private enterprise, and then there ain't much lolling around, you can depend on it. I wish Tom Scott could get his hands on this torpid old slab once. You'd see it take a different gait from this." I said I was sure he would increase the speed, if there was trade enough to justify it. "He'd make trade," said Harris. "That's the difference between governments and individuals. Governments don't care. Individuals do. Tom Scott would take all the trade. In 2 years, Gorner stock would go to 200, and inside of 2 more, you would see all the other glaciers under the hammer for taxes." After a reflective pause, Harris added, "A little less than an inch a day. A little less than an inch, mind you. Well, I am losing my reverence for glaciers." I was feeling much the same way myself. I have traveled by canal boat, ox wagon, raft, and by the Ephesus and Smyrna Railroad, but when it comes down to good, solid, honest, slow motion, I bet my money on the glacier. As a means of passenger transportation, I consider the glacier a failure, but as a vehicle for slow freight, I think she fills the bill. In the matter of putting the fine shades on that line of business, I judge she could teach the Germans something. I ordered the men to break camp and prepare for the land journey to Zermatt. At this moment, a most interesting find was made. A dark object, bedded in the glacial ice, was cut out with the ice axes, and it proved to be a piece of the undressed skin of some animal. A hair trunk, perhaps, but a close inspection disabled the hair trunk theory, and further discussion and examination exploded it entirely. That is, in the opinion of all the scientists except the one who had advanced it. This one clung to his theory with the affectionate fidelity characteristic of originators of scientific theories, and afterwards won many of the first scientists of the age to his view by a very able pamphlet which he wrote entitled "Evidences Going to Show that the Hair Trunk in a Wild State Belonged to the Early Glacial Period and Roamed the Wastes of Chaos in company with the Cave Bear, Primeval Man, and the other oolitics of the old Silurian family." Each of our scientists had a theory of his own, and put forward an animal of his own as a candidate for the skin. Each of our scientists had a theory of his own, and put forward an animal of his own as a candidate for the skin. I sided with the geologist of the expedition, in the belief that this patch of skin had once helped to cover a Siberian elephant in some old forgotten age, But we divided there, the geologist believing that this discovery proved that Siberia had formerly been located where Switzerland is now, whereas I held the opinion that it merely proved that the primeval Swiss was not the dull savage he is represented to have been, but was a being of high intellectual development who liked to go to the menagerie. We arrived that evening, after many hardships and adventures, in some fields close to the great ice arch, where the mad Visp boils and surges out from under the foot of the great Gorner Glacier, and here we camped, our perils over, and our magnificent undertaking successfully completed. We marched into Zermatt the next day, and were received with the most lavish honors and applause. A document, signed and sealed by all the authorities, was given to me, which established and endorsed the fact that I had made the ascent of the Riffelberg. This I wear around my neck, and it will be buried with me when I am no more. Chapter 40. I am not so ignorant about glacial movement now as I was when I took passage on the Gorner Glacier. I have read up since. I am aware that these vast bodies of ice do not travel at the same rate of speed. Whilst the Gorner Glacier makes less than an inch a day, the Unter Aar Glacier makes as much as 8, and still other glaciers are said to go 12, 16, and even 20 inches a day. One writer says that the slowest glacier travels 25 feet a year, and the fastest 400. What is a glacier? It is easy to say it looks like a frozen river which occupies the bed of a winding gorge or gully between mountains, but that gives no notion of its vastness, for it is sometimes 600 feet thick, and we are not accustomed to rivers 600 feet deep. No, our rivers are 6 feet, 20 feet, and sometimes 50 feet deep. We are not quite able to grasp so large a fact as an ice river 600 feet deep. The glacier's surface is not smooth and level, but has deep swales and swelling elevations, and sometimes has the look of a tossing sea, whose turbulent billows were frozen hard in the instant of their most violent motion. The glacier's surface is not a flawless mass, but is a river with cracks or crevasses, some narrow, some gaping wide. Many a man, the victim of a slip or a misstep, has plunged down one of these and met his death. Men have been fished out of them alive, but it was when they did not go to a great depth. The cold of the great depths would quickly stupefy a man, whether he was hurt or unhurt. These cracks do not go straight down. One can seldom see more than 20 to 40 feet down them. Consequently, men who have disappeared in them have been sought for, in the hope that they had stopped within helping distance, whereas their case in most instances had really been hopeless from the beginning. In 1864, a party of tourists was descending Mont Blanc, and while picking their way over one of the mighty glaciers of that lofty region, roped together, as was proper, a young porter disengaged himself from the line and started across an ice bridge which spanned a crevasse. It broke under him with a crash, and he disappeared. The others could not see how deep he had gone, so it might be worthwhile to try and rescue him. A brave young guide named Michel Payot volunteered. 2 ropes were made fast to his leather belt, and he bore the end of the third one in his hand to tie to the victim in case he found him. He was lowered into the crevasse. He descended deeper and deeper between the clear blue walls of solid ice. He approached a bend in the crack and disappeared under. Down and still down he went into this profound grave. When he had reached a depth of 80 feet, he passed under another bend in the crack, and thence descended 80 feet lower, as between perpendicular precipices. Arrived at this stage of 160 feet below the surface of the glacier, he peered through the twilight dimness, and perceived that the chasm took another turn and stretched away at a steep slant to unknown deeps, for its course was lost in darkness. What a place that was to be in, especially if that leather belt should break! The compression of the belt threatened to suffocate the intrepid fellow. He called to his friends to draw him up, but could not make them hear. They still lowered him deeper and deeper. Then he jerked his third cord as vigorously as he could. His friends understood, and dragged him out of those icy jaws of death. Then they attached a bottle to a cord and sent it down 200 feet. But it found no bottom. It came up covered with congelations, evidence enough that if the poor porter reached the bottom with unbroken bones, a swift death from cold was sure anyway. A glacier is a stupendous, ever-progressing, resistless plow. It pushes ahead of its masses of boulders which are packed together, and they stretch across the gorge right in front of it, like a long grave or a long, sharp roof. This is called a moraine. It also shoves out a moraine along each side of its course. Imposing as the modern glaciers are, they are not so huge as were some that once existed. For instance, Mr. Whymper says, "At some very remote period, the valley of Aosta was occupied by a vast glacier, which flowed down its entire length from Mont Blanc to the plain of Piedmont, remained stationary, or nearly so, at its mouth for many centuries, and deposited there enormous masses of debris. The length of this glacier exceeded 80 miles, and it drained a basin 25 to 35 miles across, bounded by the highest mountains in the Alps. The great peaks rose several thousand feet above the glaciers, and then, as now, shattered by sun and frost, poured down their showers of rocks and stones, in witness of which there are the immense piles of angular fragments that constitute the moraines of Ivrea. The moraines around Ivrea are of extraordinary dimensions. That which was on the left bank of the glacier is about 13 miles long, and in some places rises to a height of 2,130 feet above the floor of the valley. The terminal moraines, those which are pushed in front of the glaciers, cover something like 20 square miles of country. At the mouth of the valley of the Aosta, the thickness of the glacier must have been at least 2,000 feet, and its width at that part 5 miles and a quarter. It is not easy to get at a comprehension of a mass of ice like that. If one could cleave off the butt end of such a glacier, an oblong block 2 or 3 miles wide by 5 1/4 long and 2,000 feet thick, he could completely hide the city of New York under it, and Trinity steeple would only stick up into it relatively as far as a shingle nail would stick up into the bottom of a Saratoga trunk. The boulders from Mont Blanc upon the plain below Ivrea assure us that the glacier which transported them existed for a prodigious length of time. Their present distance from the cliffs from which they were derived is about 420,000 feet, and if we assume that they traveled at the rate of 400 feet per annum, their journey must have occupied them no less than 1,055 years. In all probability, they did not travel so fast. Glaciers are sometimes hurried out of their characteristic snail pace. A marvelous spectacle is presented then. Mr. Whymper refers to a case which occurred in Iceland in 1721. It seems that in the neighborhood of the mountain Katlugja, large bodies of water formed underneath or within the glaciers, either on account of the interior heat of the earth or from other causes, and at length acquired irresistible power, tore the glaciers from their mooring on the land, and swept them over every obstacle into the sea. Prodigious masses of ice were thus born for a distance of about 10 miles over land in the space of a few hours, and their bulk was so enormous that they covered the sea for 7 miles from the shore, and remained aground in 600 feet of water. The denudation of the land was upon a grand scale. All superficial accumulations were swept away, and the bedrock was exposed. It was described in graphic language how all irregularities and depressions were obliterated, and a smooth surface of several miles area laid bare, and that this area had the appearance of having been planed by a plane. The account, translated from the Icelandic, says that the mountain-like ruins of this majestic glacier so covered the sea that as far as the eye could reach, no open water was discoverable, even from the highest peaks. A monster wall or barrier of ice was built across a considerable stretch of land, too, by this strange eruption. One can form some idea of the altitude of this barrier of ice when it is mentioned that from Hofdabreka farm, which lies high up on a fjeld, one could not see Hjorleifshofdi opposite, which is a fell 640 feet in height, but in order to do so, had to clamber up a mountain slope east of Hofdabreka, 1,200 feet high. These things will help the reader to understand why it is that a man who keeps company with glaciers comes to feel tolerably insignificant by and by. The Alps and the glaciers together are able to take every bit of conceit out of a man and reduce his self-importance to zero, if he will only remain within the influence of their sublime presence long enough to give it a fair and reasonable chance to do its work. The alpine glaciers move. That is granted now by everybody. But there was a time when people scoffed at the idea. They said you might as well expect leagues of solid rock to crawl along the ground as expect solid leagues of ice to do it. But proof after proof was furnished, and finally the world had to believe. The wise men not only said the glacier moved, but they timed its movement. They ciphered out a glacier's gait and then said confidently that it would travel just so far in so many years. There is record of a striking and curious example of the accuracy which may be attained in these reckonings. In 1820, the ascent of Mont Blanc was attempted by a Russian and 2 Englishmen with 7 guides. They had reached a prodigious altitude and were approaching the summit when an avalanche swept several of the party down a sharp slope of 200 feet and hurled 5 of them, all guides, into one of the crevasses of a glacier. The life of one of the 5 was saved by a long barometer which was strapped to his back. It bridged the crevasse and suspended him until help came. The alpenstock, or baton, of another saved its owner in a similar way. 3 men were lost, Pierre Balmat, Pierre Carrier, and Auguste Terrat. They had been hurled down into the fathomless great deeps of the crevasse. Dr. Forbes, the English geologist, had made frequent visits to the Mont Blanc region and had given much attention to the disputed question of the movement of glaciers. During one of these visits, he completed his estimates of the rate of movement of the glacier which had swallowed up the 3 guides, and uttered the prediction that the glacier would deliver up its dead at the foot of the mountain 35 years from the time of the accident, or possibly 40. A dull, slow journey, a movement imperceptible to any eye, but it was proceeding nevertheless and without cessation. It was a journey which a rolling stone would make in a few seconds. The lofty point of departure was visible from the village below in the valley. The prediction cut curiously close to the truth. 41 years after the catastrophe, the remains were cast forth at the foot of the glacier. I find an interesting account of the matter in the Histoire du Mont Blanc by Stephen Darve. I will condense this account as follows. On the 12th of August, 1861, at the hour of the close of Mass, a guide arrived out of breath at the Mairie of Chamonix, and bearing on his shoulders a very lugubrious burden. It was a sack filled with human remains which he had gathered from the orifice of a crevasse in the Glacier des Bossons. He conjectured that these were remains of the victims of the catastrophe of 1820, and a minute inquest immediately instituted by the local authorities soon demonstrated the correctness of his supposition. The contents of the sack were spread upon a long table and officially inventoried as follows: portions of 3 human skulls, several tufts of black and blonde hair, a human jaw furnished with fine white teeth, a forearm and hand, all the fingers of the latter intact. The flesh was white and fresh, and both the arm and hand preserved a degree of flexibility in the articulations. The ring finger had suffered a slight abrasion, and the stain of blood was still visible and unchanged after 41 years. A left foot, the flesh white and fresh. Along with these fragments were portions of waistcoats, hats, hobnailed shoes and other clothing, a wing of a pigeon with black feathers, a fragment of an alpenstock, a tin lantern, and lastly a boiled leg of mutton, the only flesh among all the remains that exhaled an unpleasant odor. The guide said that the mutton had no odor when he took it from the glacier. An hour's exposure to the sun had already begun the work of decomposition upon it. Persons were called for to identify these poor, pathetic relics, and a touching scene ensued. 2 men were still living who had witnessed the grim catastrophe of nearly half a century before: Marie Coutet, saved by his baton, and Julien Davouassou, saved by the barometer. These aged men entered and approached the table. Davouassou, more than 80 years old, contemplated the mournful remains mutely and with a vacant eye, for his intelligence and his memory were torpid with age. But Coutet's faculties were still perfect at 72, and he exhibited strong emotion. He said, "Pierre Balmat was fair. He wore a straw hat. This bit of skull with the tuft of blonde hair was his. This is his hat. Pierre Carrier was very dark. This skull was his, and this felt hat. This is Balmat's hand. I remember it so well." And the old man bent down and kissed it reverently, then closed his fingers upon it in an affectionate grasp, crying out, "I could never have dared to believe that before quitting this world it would be granted me to press once more the hand of one of those brave comrades, the hand of my good friend Balmat." There is something weirdly pathetic about the picture of that white-haired veteran greeting with his loving handshake this friend who had been dead 40 years. When these hands had met last, they were alike in the softness and freshness of youth. Now one was brown and wrinkled and horny with age, while the other was still as young and fair and blemishless as if those 40 years had come and gone in a single moment, leaving no mark of their passage. Time had gone on in the one case, it had stood still in the other. A man who has not seen a friend for a generation keeps him in mind always as he saw him last, and is somehow surprised and is also shocked to see the aging change the years have wrought when he sees him again. Marie Coutet's experience in finding his friend's hand unaltered from the image of it which he had carried in his memory for 40 years is an experience which stands alone in the history of man, perhaps. Coutet identified other relics. This hat belonged to Auguste Terray. He carried the cage of pigeons which we proposed to set free upon the summit. Here is the wing of one of those pigeons, and here is the fragment of my broken baton. It was by grace of the baton that my life was saved. Who could have told me that I should one day have the satisfaction to look again upon this bit of wood that supported me above the grave that swallowed up my unfortunate companions? No portions of the body of Terray had been found, A diligent search was made, but without result. However, another search was instituted a year later, and this had better success. Many fragments of clothing which had belonged to the lost guides were discovered, also part of a lantern and a green veil with bloodstains on it. But the interesting feature was this. One of the searchers came suddenly upon a sleeved arm projecting from a crevice in the ice wall, with the hand outstretched as if offering greeting. The nails of this white hand were still rosy, and the pose of the extended fingers seemed to express an eloquent welcome to the long-lost light of day. The hand and arm were alone. There was no trunk. After being removed from the ice, the flesh tints quickly faded, and the rosy nails took on the alabaster hue of death. This was the third right hand found. Therefore, all three of the lost men were accounted for beyond cavil or question. Dr. Hamel was the Russian gentleman of the party which made the ascent at the time of the famous disaster. He left Chamonix as soon as he conveniently could after the descent, and as he had shown a chilly indifference about the calamity, and offered neither sympathy nor assistance to the widows and orphans, he carried with him the cordial execrations of the whole community. 4 months before the first remains were found, a Chamonix guide named Balmat, a relative of one of the lost men, was in London, and one day encountered a hale old gentleman in the British Museum who said, "I overheard your name. Are you from Chamonix, Monsieur Balmat?" "Yes, sir." "Haven't they found the bodies of my 3 guides yet? I am Dr. Hamel." "Alas, no, monsieur." "Well, you'll find them, sooner or later." "Yes, it is the opinion of Dr. Forbes and Mr. Tyndall that the glacier will sooner or later restore to us the remains of the unfortunate victims." "Without a doubt, without a doubt. And it will be a great thing for Chamonix in the matter of attracting tourists. You can get up a museum with those remains that will draw." This savage idea had not improved the odor of Dr. Hamel's name in Chamonix by any means. But after all, the man was sound on human nature. His idea was conveyed to the public officials of Chamonix, and they gravely discussed it around the official council table. They were only prevented from carrying it into execution by the determined opposition of the friends and descendants of the lost guides, who insisted on giving the remains Christian burial, and succeeded in their purpose. A close watch had to be kept upon all the poor remnants and fragments to prevent embezzlement. A few accessory odds and ends were sold. Rags and scraps of the coarse clothing were parted with at a rate equal to about $20 a yard. A piece of a lantern and 1 or 2 other trifles brought nearly their weight in gold, and an Englishman offered £1 sterling for a single breeches button. Chapter 41. One of the most memorable of all the Alpine catastrophes was that of July 1865 on the Matterhorn, already slightly referred to a few pages back. The details of it are scarcely known in America. To the vast majority of readers, they are not known at all. Mr. Whymper's account is the only authentic one. I will import the chief portion of it into this book, partly because of its intrinsic interest, and partly because it gives such a vivid idea of what the perilous pastime of Alp climbing is. This was Mr. Whymper's 9th attempt during a series of years to vanquish that steep and stubborn pillar of rock. It succeeded. The other 8 were failures. No man had ever accomplished the ascent before, though the attempts had been numerous. Mr. Whymper's narrative. We started from Zermatt on July 13 at 5:30 on a brilliant and perfectly cloudless morning. We were 8 in number: Crow, guide; old Peter Taugwalder, guide, and his 2 sons; Lord F. Douglas, Mr. Haddow, Reverend Mr. Hudson, and I. To ensure steady motion, one tourist and one native walked together. The youngest Taugwalder fell to my share. The wine bags also fell to my lot to carry, and throughout the day after each drink I replenished them secretly with water, so that at the next halt they were found fuller than before. This was considered a good omen and little short of miraculous. On the first day we did not intend to ascend to any great height, and we mounted accordingly very leisurely. Before 12 o'clock we had found a good position for the tent at a height of 11,000 feet. We passed the remaining hours of daylight, some basking in the sunshine, some sketching, some collecting. Hudson made tea, I coffee, and at length we retired, each one to his blanket bag. We assembled together before dawn on the 14th, and started directly it was light enough to move. One of the young Taugwalders returned to Zermatt. In a few minutes we turned the rib which had intercepted the view of the eastern face from our tent platform. The whole of this great slope was now revealed, rising for 3,000 feet like a huge natural staircase. Some parts were more and others were less easy, but we were not once brought to a halt by any serious impediment, for when an obstruction was met in front, it could always be turned to the right or to the left. For the greater part of the way there was no occasion, indeed, for the rope, and sometimes Hudson led, sometimes myself. At 6:20 we had attained a height of 12,800 feet, and halted for half an hour. We then continued the ascent without a break until 9:55, when we stopped for 50 minutes at a height of 14,000 feet. We had now arrived at the foot of that part which, seen from the Riffelberg, seemed perpendicular or overhanging. We could no longer continue on the eastern side. For a little distance we ascended by snow upon the arete, that is, the ridge, then turned over to the right or northern side. The work became difficult and required caution. In some places there was little to hold. The general slope of the mountain was less than 40 degrees, and snow had accumulated in and had filled up the interstices of the rock face, leaving only occasional fragments projecting here and there. These were at times covered with a thin film of ice. It was a place which any fair mountaineer might pass in safety. We bore away nearly horizontally for about 400 feet, then ascended directly towards the summit for about 60 feet, then doubled back to the ridge which descends towards Zermatt. A long stride round a rather awkward corner brought us to snow once more. The last doubt vanished. The Matterhorn was ours. Nothing but 200 feet of easy snow remained to be surmounted. The higher we rose, the more intense became the excitement. The slope eased off. At length we could be detached, and Crow and I, dashing away, ran a neck-and-neck race, which ended in a dead heat. At 1:40 p.m., the world was at our feet, and the Matterhorn was conquered. The others arrived. Crow now took the tent pole and planted it in the highest snow. "Yes," we said, "there is the flagstaff. But where is the flag?" "Here it is," he answered, pulling off his blouse and fixing it to the stick. It made a poor flag, and there was no wind to float it out, yet it was seen all around. They saw it at Zermatt, at the Riffel, in the Val Tournanche. We remained on the summit for 1 hour. 1 crowded hour of glorious life. It passed away too quickly, and we began to prepare for the descent. Hudson and I consulted as to the best and safest arrangement of the party. We agreed that it was best for Crow to go first and Haddo second. Hudson, who was almost equal to a guide in sureness of foot, wished to be third. Lord Douglas was placed next, and old Peter, the strongest of the remainder, after him. I suggested to Hudson that we should attach a rope to the rocks on our arrival at the difficult bit and hold it as we descended, as an additional protection. He approved the idea, but it was not definitely decided that it should be done. The party was being arranged in the order above whilst I was sketching the summit, and they had finished and were waiting for me to be tied in line, when someone remembered that our names had not been left in a bottle. They requested me to write them down, and moved off while it was being done. A few minutes afterwards I tied myself to young Pater, ran down after the others, and caught them just as they were commencing the descent of the difficult part. Great care was being taken. Only one man was moving at a time. When he was firmly planted, the next advanced, and so on. They had not, however, attached the additional rope to rocks, and nothing was said about it. The suggestion was not made for my own sake, and I am not sure that it even occurred to me again. For some little distance we too followed the others, detached from them, and should have continued so, had not Lord Douglas asked me about 3 p.m. to tie on to old Pater, as he feared. He said that Taugwalder would not be able to hold his ground if a slip occurred. A few minutes later, a sharp-eyed lad ran into the Monte Rosa Hotel at Zermatt, saying that he had seen an avalanche fall from the summit of the Matterhorn onto the Matterhorn glacier. The boy was reproved for telling idle stories. He was right, nevertheless, and this was what he saw. Michel Cros had laid aside his axe, and in order to give Mr. Haddo greater security, was absolutely taking hold of his legs and putting his feet one by one into their proper positions. As far as I know, no one was actually descending. I cannot speak with certainty because the two leading men were partially hidden from my sight by an intervening mass of rock. But it is my belief, from the movements of their shoulders, that Cros, having done as I have said, was in the act of turning round to go down a step or two himself. At this moment Mr. Haddo slipped, fell against him, and knocked him over. I heard one startled exclamation from Cros, then saw him and Mr. Haddo flying downwards. In another moment Hudson was dragged from his steps, and Lord Douglas immediately after him. All this was the work of a moment. Immediately we heard Crow's exclamation, old Pater and I planted ourselves as firmly as the rocks would permit. The rope was taut between us, and the jerk came on us both as on one man. We held. But the rope broke midway between Taugwalder and Lord Francis Douglas. For a few seconds we saw our unfortunate companions sliding downwards on their backs, and spreading out their hands, endeavoring to save themselves. They passed from our sight uninjured, disappeared one by one, and fell from precipice to precipice onto the Matterhorn glacier below, a distance of nearly 4,000 feet in height. From the moment the rope broke, it was impossible to help them. So perished our comrades. For more than 2 hours afterwards, I thought almost every moment that the next would be my last, for the Taugwalders, utterly unnerved, were not only incapable of giving assistance, but were in such a state that a slip might have been expected from them at any moment. After a time, we were able to do that which should have been done at first, and fixed rope to firm rocks, in addition to being tied together. These ropes were cut from time to time, and were left behind. Even with their assurance, the men were afraid to proceed, and several times old Pater turned with ashy face and faltering limbs, and said with terrible emphasis, "I cannot." About 6 p.m. we arrived at the snow upon the ridge descending towards Zermatt, and all peril was over. We frequently looked, but in vain, for traces of our unfortunate companions. We bent over the ridge and cried to them, but no sound returned. Convinced at last that they were neither within sight nor hearing, we ceased from our useless efforts, and, too cast down for speech, silently gathered up our things and the little effects of those who were lost, and then completed the descent. Such is Mr. Whymper's graphic and thrilling narrative. Zermatt gossip darkly hints that the elder Tauchwalder cut the rope when the accident occurred in order to preserve himself from being dragged into the abyss. But Mr. Whymper says that the ends of the rope showed no evidence of cutting, but only of breaking. He adds that if Taugwalder had had the disposition to cut the rope, he would not have had the time to do it. The accident was so sudden and unexpected. Lord Douglas's body has never been found. It probably lodged upon some inaccessible shelf in the face of the mighty precipice. Lord Douglas was a youth of 19. The 3 other victims fell nearly 4,000 feet, and their bodies lay together upon the glacier when found by Mr. Whymper and the other searchers the next morning. Their graves are beside the little church in Zermatt. Chapter 42. Switzerland is simply a large, humpy, solid rock with a thin skin of grass stretched over it. Consequently, they do not dig graves, they blast them out with powder and fuse. They cannot afford to have large graveyards. The grass skin is too circumscribed and too valuable. It is all required for the support of the living. The graveyard in Zermatt occupies only about 1/8 of an acre. The graves are sunk in the living rock and are very permanent, but occupation of them is only temporary. The occupant can only stay till his grave is needed by a later subject. He is removed then, for they do not bury one body on top of another. As I understand it, a family owns a grave just as it owns a house. A man dies and leaves his house to his son, and at the same time this dead father succeeds to his own father's grave. He moves out of the house and into the grave, and his predecessor moves out of the grave and into the cellar of the chapel. I saw a black box lying in the churchyard with skull and crossbones painted on it, and was told that this was used in transferring remains to the cellar. In that cellar, the bones and skulls of several hundreds of former citizens were compactly corded up. They made a pile 18 feet long, 7 feet high, and 8 feet wide. I was told that in some of the receptacles of this kind in the Swiss villages, the skulls were all marked, and if a man wished to find the skulls of his ancestors for several generations back, he could do it by these marks, preserved in the family records. An English gentleman who had lived some years in this region said it was the cradle of compulsory education. But he said that the English idea that compulsory education would reduce bastardy and intemperance was an error. It has not that effect. He said there was more seduction in the Protestant than in the Catholic cantons, because the confessional protected the girls. I wonder why it doesn't protect married women in France and Spain. This gentleman said that among the poorer peasants in the Valais, it was common for the brothers in a family to cast lots to determine which of them should have the coveted privilege of marrying. Then the lucky one got married, and his brethren, doomed bachelors, heroically banded themselves together to help support the new family. We left Zermatt in a wagon, and in a rainstorm too, for St. Nicholas about 10 o'clock one morning. Again we passed between those grass-clad, prodigious cliffs speckled with weed dwellings, peeping over at us from velvety green walls 10 and 1,200 feet high. It did not seem possible that the imaginary chamois even could climb those precipices. Lovers on the opposite cliffs probably kiss through a spyglass and correspond with a rifle. In Switzerland, the farmer's plow is a wide shovel which scrapes up and turns over the thin, earthy skin of his native rock, and there the man of the plow is a hero. Now here, by our St. Nicholas road, was a grave. and it had a tragic story. A plowman was skinning his farm one morning, not the steepest part of it, but still a steep part. That is, he was not skinning the front of his farm, but the roof of it, near the eaves, when he absent-mindedly let go of the plow handles to moisten his hands in the usual way. He lost his balance and fell out of his farm backwards. Poor fellow, he never touched anything till he struck the bottom 1,500 feet below. This was on a Sunday, M.T. We throw a halo of heroism around the life of the soldier and the sailor because of the deadly dangers they are facing all the time. We are not used to looking upon farming as an heroic occupation. This is because we have not lived in Switzerland. From St. Nicholas we struck out for Visp or Vispach on foot. The rainstorms had been at work during several days and had done a deal of damage in Switzerland and Savoy. We came to one place where a stream had changed its course and plunged down the mountain in a new place, sweeping everything before it. 2 poor but precious farms by the roadside were ruined. One was washed clear away and the bedrock exposed. The other was buried out of sight under a tumbled chaos of rocks, gravel, mud, and rubbish. The resistless might of water was well exemplified. Some saplings which had stood in the way were bent to the ground, stripped clean of their bark, and buried under rocky debris. The road had been swept away, too. In another place, where the road was high up on the mountain's face, and its outside edge protected by flimsy masonry, we frequently came across spots where this masonry had caved off and left dangerous gaps for mules to get over, and with still more frequency we found the masonry slightly crumbled and marked by mule hoofs, thus showing that there had been danger of an accident to somebody. When at last we came to a badly ruptured bit of masonry with hoof prints evidencing a desperate struggle to regain the lost foothold, I looked quite hopefully over the dizzy precipice, but there was nobody down there. They take exceedingly good care of their rivers in Switzerland and other portions of Europe. They wall up both banks with slanting, solid stone masonry, so that from end to end of these rivers the banks look like the wharves at St. Louis or other towns on the Mississippi River. They take exceedingly good care of their rivers in Switzerland and other portions of Europe. They wall up both banks with slanting, solid stone masonry, so that from end to end of these rivers the banks look like the wharves at St. Louis or other towns on the Mississippi River. It was during this walk from St. Nicholas, in the shadow of the majestic Alps, that we came across some little children amusing themselves in what seemed at first a most odd and original way, but it wasn't. It was in simply a natural and characteristic way. They were roped together with a string, they had mimic alpenstocks and ice axes, and were climbing a meek and lowly manure pile with a most blood-curdling amount of care and caution. The guide at the head of the line cut imaginary steps in a laborious and painstaking way, and not a monkey budged till the step above him was vacated. If we had waited, we should have witnessed an imaginary accident, no doubt, and we should have heard the intrepid band hurrah when they made the summit and looked around upon the magnificent view, and seen them throw themselves down in exhausted attitudes for a rest in that commanding situation. In Nevada, I used to see children play at silver mining. Of course, the great thing was an accident in a mine, and there were 2 star parts, that of the man who fell down the mimic shaft, and that of the daring hero who was lowered into the depths to bring him up. I know one small chap who always insisted on playing both of these parts, and he carried his point. He would tumble into the shaft and die, and then come to the surface and go back after his own remains. It is the smartest boy that gets the hero part everywhere. He is head guide in Switzerland, head miner in Nevada, head bullfighter in Spain, etc. But I knew a preacher's son, 7 years old, who once selected a part for himself, compared to which those just mentioned are tame and unimpressive. Jimmy's father stopped him from driving imaginary horse cars on Sunday, stopped him from playing captain of an imaginary steamboat next Sunday, stopped him from leading an imaginary army to battle the following Sunday, and so on. Finally, the little fellow said, "I've tried everything, and they won't any of them do. What can I play?" "I hardly know, Jimmy, but you must play only things that are suitable to the Sabbath day." Next Sunday, the preacher stepped softly to a back-room door to see if the children were rightly employed. He peeped in. A chair occupied the middle of the room, and on the back of it hung Jimmy's cap. One of the little sisters took the cap down, nibbled at it, then passed it to another small sister and said, "Eat of this fruit, for it is good." The Reverend took in the situation. Alas, they were playing the expulsion from Eden. Yet he found one little crumb of comfort. He said to himself, "For once Jimmy has yielded the chief role. I have been wronging him. I did not believe there was so much modesty in him. I should have expected him to be either Adam or Eve." This crumb of comfort lasted but a very little while. He glanced around and discovered Jimmy standing in an imposing attitude in a corner with a dark and deadly frown on his face. What that meant was very plain. He was personating the deity. Think of the guileless sublimity of that idea. We reached Fispach at 8 p.m., only about 7 hours out from St. Nicholas, so we must have made fully a mile and a half an hour, and it was all downhill, too, and very muddy at that. We stayed all night at the Hôtel du Soleil. I remember it because the landlady, the portier, the waitress, and the chambermaid were not separate persons, but were all contained in one neat and chipper suit of spotless muslin, and she was the prettiest young creature I saw in all that region. She was the landlord's daughter, and I remember that the only native match to her I saw in all Europe was the young daughter of the landlord of a village inn in the Black Forest. Why don't more people in Europe marry and keep hotel? Next morning, we left with a family of English friends and went by train to Brevet, and thus by boat across the lake to Ouchy, Lausanne. Ouchy is memorable to me, not on account of its beautiful situation and lovely surroundings, although these would make it stick long in one's memory, but as the place where I caught the London Times dropping into humor. It was not aware of it, though. It did not do it on purpose. An English friend called my attention to this lapse and cut out the reprehensible paragraph for me. Think of encountering a grin like this on the face of that grim journal. Erratum. We are requested by Reuters Telegram Company to correct an erroneous announcement made in their Brisbane Telegram of the 2nd instant, published in our impression of the 5th instant, stating that Lady Kennedy had given birth to twins, the eldest being a son. The company explained that the message they received contained the words, "Governor of Queensland, twins' first son." Being, however, subsequently informed that Sir Arthur Kennedy was unmarried and that there must be some mistake, a telegraphic repetition was at once demanded. It has been received today, 11th instant, and shows that the words really telegraphed by Reuters' agent were, "Governor Queensland turns first sod," alluding to the Maryborough-Gympie Railway in course of construction. The words in italics were mutilated by the telegraph in transmission from Australia, and reaching the company in the form mentioned above gave rise to the mistake. I had always had a deep and reverent compassion for the sufferings of the prisoner of Chillon, whose story Byron has told in such moving verse. So I took the steamer and made pilgrimage to the dungeons of the castle of Chillon to see the place where poor Bonneval endured his dreary captivity 300 years ago. I am glad I did that, for it took away some of the pain I was feeling on the prisoner's account. His dungeon was a nice, cool, roomy place, and I cannot see why he should have been so dissatisfied with it. If he had been imprisoned in a St. Nicholas private dwelling where the fertilizer prevails and the goat sleeps with the guest,